But good evening, y'all, and welcome to the Black Trust Chuck Turner Arts and Lecture Series. So y'all, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you so much also for coming to Just Bookish, which is in the middle of their sort of soft opening, soft launch right now. Give it up for Just Bookish. Thank you so much for coming through. My name is Alula Hunson, and I'm an editorial manager at the Boston Ujima Project. I'm standing next to Sierra Peters, director of many things, comms, culture, and enfranchisement. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or who are unfamiliar with us, the Boston Ujima Project is a Black-led, democratic, member-run organization building a cooperative business, arts, and investment ecosystem in Boston with a mission to return wealth to working-class communities of color. Ujima is bringing together neighbors, workers, business owners, investors, grassroots organizers, and culture makers to create a community-controlled economy in our city. Tonight, we are gathering in celebration of Black Utopias, past, present, and future. Now, a thought that might be on your mind, so I mentioned earlier that we're in the Black Trust Chuck Turner Arts and Culture Lecture Series, and you might be wondering why Black Trust, or what does that mean? So the Boston Ujima Project is making a commitment to lend to finance, and to invest in businesses, real estate, and other community initiatives in Boston's working class communities. And fundamental to all of this work and fundamental to this endeavor is building trust amongst one another. Before credit scores, before FICO, before Equifax, the act of lending was personal, and qualification was really grounded in a sense of a person's character. It was grounded in relationality, work ethic, trustworthiness. But it was also grounded in sort of these more nefarious aspects, the enslavement of Black folks who were capital, and business that precluded us from being properly recognized as deserving of opportunities to fulfill our dreams to receive investment. Now, while Ujima is focused on people of color writ large, we recognize that it's a pervasive anti-Blackness that accompanies white supremacy, which undergirds the systems that we're fighting against, and this must be disintegrated. So we're here in the pursuit of love and freedom. Black Trust is an external and, more importantly, an internal declaration and commitment to one another. Before we get started with the program, just want to share a few housekeeping notes, some asks and some announcements. So we're going to kindly ask that you refrain from flash photography or recording any part of this performance, at least while folks are talking up here. We don't want the flash going off in their face. Please also turn off or switch to silent any cell phones, electronic devices that you might have. And in the event of an emergency, please take note of the nearest exit, which I believe is towards the back, the way that y'all came in. And if an evacuation is necessary or if something is going wrong, please let Just Bookish staff know or one of us know what's going on. So we've got Bing in the back. We got Tabia walking around. We've got Jeremiah somewhere. Yeah, with the hand up, who's handling audio visual for us tonight. Lastly, I want to make note that this event is the first of a two-part series. So next week, we will be hosting Jessica Gordon-Nemhard and Dr. Asada Richards at our Ujima Wednesdays at 6 p.m. It's titled Land, Labor, and Legacy. So you can keep up with our work, keep up with that lecture, and find more information about Ujima Wednesdays on our website, which is ujimaboston.com, UJIMA Boston.com, or on social media at Ujima Boston on all platforms. I'd like to, I guess you're standing right here. Please welcome Sierra Peters, our Director of Comms, Culture, and Enfranchisement, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Alula. Good evening, everyone. We are so thrilled to have you here for Black Utopias, Then and Now. This Black Trust is truly a special one for us, as it marks our first Black Trust event as an independent organization. You can clap. No. Okay, thank you. And it's the 11th Black Trust in the series.
Well, nice.
All right. So we would like to extend our gratitude to a few supporters for making this event possible. First of all, Bing, Jeremiah, and Portia, who is not here, are collaborators and co-hosts for the event, who have so lovingly opened up their space for us. This is, as Alula mentioned, their soft launch. You will be opening on November 23rd. So come back, get a book, make sure that you, at the end of the event, purchase a copy of the Black Utopians. That's just a side note. Some of you that might remember that in 2021, we held our first real estate assembly called the Lovely Embrace. We are so proud to say that we are standing in a building which members learned about at the Lovely Embrace Assembly. Much like, yeah, okay. I mean, that's kind of cool. Much like our Ujima Fund, 1463 Dorchester Ave is Dorchester's first crowd-funded building, apartment building. Cool. It has offered an opportunity for Boston residents to have shared ownership of this property.
I love that.
This is a true example of power building in our communities. And now it's the new home of Just Bookish, our event co-sponsors. So for this reason and many more, we are so excited to have you all here. And, we're excited to be here. We want to thank our entire Ujima team, in particular our comms, culture, and community engagement staff. We have Genoa here, we have Natasha here, we have Nia K. Evans here, we got Arifa here, Kamaria is somewhere in here. We got Mary and Gio in the front who are doing all your COVID tests, so thank you all. And finally, I want to thank and introduce our speakers. So we are here on the occasion of this publication, The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America, written by Aaron Robertson. And this book asks us, how do the disillusioned, the forgotten, the persecuted, and the persecuted not merely hold on to life, but expand its possibilities and preserve its beauty? In other words, what does a utopia look like in Black? Aaron Robertson is a writer, editor, and translator of Italian literature. His translation of I'm going to need your support.
Igiaba Shego.
Igiaba Shego's Beyond Babylon was shortlisted for the 2020 Penn Translation Prize and the National Translation Award, and in 2021, he received a National Endowment for the Arts Grant. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy, N+1, The Point, Literary Hub, among many other publications. And today we learned that he is also on the Times 100 Best Books of 2024. We also have, I'm going to refer to you by your full name, Dr.
No, you don't.
I'm sorry. Stacey Sutton.
Emphasizes that too.
Stacey Sutton, PhD. Who is an associate professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy at UIC and serves as the Director of Applied Research and Strategic Partnerships at the university's Social Justice Initiatives. She leads the Solidarity Economy Research Policy and Law Project, advancing interdisciplinary research policy and community alliances to strengthen solidarity economy ecosystems. Her scholarship centers on racial, economic, cooperative cities, economic democracy, and the disparate impacts of punitive urban policies. Sutton's work critically examines the role of worker-owned cooperatives in community wealth building, particularly in Black communities. She collaborates with many grassroots organizations, and in 2025, we're going to be visiting Stacey for the next Assembly of Black Possibilities in Chicago.
That's right. That's right.
So with that, I'm going to pass it back to you all. Thank you all for being here. And let us compliment.
All right. I feel like I'm about to sing or something. Well, first, thank you all for being here. This is so exciting to be in this, beautiful space and collaborating with Boston Ujima Project. So thank you all. Before we have our conversation, I wanted to read a short passage from the book that frames this idea of Black utopianism. What is it? What is the particular framework that I'm working from? This was a book that I started to write in 2020 as the world was chaotic, and I was at a really low point, but I was trying to take encouragement from social movements in the past, from people who had lived through periods of tumult and still held on to a sense of I think, hope, which I think is something that we'll talk a little bit more about today. So if you'll bear with me. Okay. If tomorrow brought with it the possibility of death, as I too often expected, my conception of the future needed to be transformed. The apparent persistence of abysmal realities for Black people, and the certainty that there exists much more besides, is the soil from which Black utopianism emerges. This tradition has encouraged Black people to decide for ourselves how our inner resources can best be used to transform the outer world. It is an unceasing orientation toward the possibilities inherent in Black social life. Once the usual horizons we depend on to orient our daily lives blur, the utopian impulse to create new forms of living arises. Unfamiliarity and disruption are the point. Utopia points to the way our attempted solutions to large-scale crises might bend further away from the worlds that produce these problems. In the utopia that is Black, constant striving for wholesale societal transformation is imperative, not optional. The creative expressions of Black utopianism aspire to a world in which the social, economic, and political restrictions that have historically been imposed on Black people will not define their futures. The urge to act out alternatives to the constrictive rhythms of our days lies at the heart of utopia. It is not necessarily a place, but an expression of faith that is sustained by the innumerable ways we could have led our lives and could still. Those who believe in utopia's power refuse to live as though any path has been foreclosed. It is an ongoing exchange between people, and so it is never achieved, attained, or finished. It is only rehearsed. Utopia always describes a crossroads, a perpetual opening. And so a lot of our work is rooted in different ways, I think, in the notion of utopia. Right now, Stacey, a lot of your thought and work is focused on what you refer to as real Black utopias. So could you talk a little bit about the background of that, and especially the emphasis on this word real? What is that framework for you, and when did you start to conceive of it?
Yeah, thank you. And just thank you for that reading and for your work, for this contribution. It's a beautiful book. It's beautiful to read, but I also, and I was gifted a copy, but I also purchased an ebook, an audio book, so I could listen to it. And it's beautifully done there as well. They're quite similar. So one of the projects that I've been working on for some time is called Building Real Black Utopias, Ideologies, Infrastructures, and Practices at the Radical Edge of Economy. So that kind of encompasses all of the elements. But the idea of real Black utopias, I think you kind of touched on it. It comes from kind of a Marxist sociologist, Eric Olin Wright. Right? He wrote about real utopias. And he defined them as this kind of contradiction in terms of thinking about utopia as not a place, but a kind of a process that is both idealized but yet never fully achieved. So there's always this aspiration for achieving this kind of perfect kind of place. I mean, this perfect thing, right, that we envision. So it's so that I kind of built on that. But one of the things missing from his work is any attention to race, attention to Blackness, and attention to place. And so although utopia, in my mind, and as you said, is not a place-based kind of ideation. It is grounded in kind of people's understanding and resistance to systems of oppression. The work we do is place-based. The way in which we kind of manifest these things gets located in place. And so I started and kind of ruminating with his work probably around the same time, right? In around 2019, 2020. And said, okay, I see this. I see what he's talking about. And he was pointing to examples like, at the time he wrote this, it was in the early 2000s. And so he was pointing to examples like participatory budgeting and Wikipedia or, open source kind of platforms. And when I started thinking about it, I started looking at cities, right? That's what I do in planners. So I started looking at how these kind of what people call alternative, what they're actually kind of indigenous African-centered practices in many ways. These practices are manifesting in different cities. So I wanted to understand that, and that became the impetus for the research to explore these ecosystems. And Boston is surely one of them. And so over the last year, I went to 14 different cities to some of that field work.
And, within the last week, I've had a chance to have some conversations about the book, and the obvious question that I think we're wrestling with now is, you talk about utopia, right? And we feel, it seems to so many people that we are in a decidedly anti-utopian moment
Right.
in this country and beyond even. And so I'm curious, where has your mind and heart been this last week in relation to the kind of work you've been doing? Because, your work on worker co-ops, for example, really picked up after the recession, when there was this boom over the course of, I think, a decade or so, when worker co-ops were starting to expand. People were really becoming a part of, or learning about what we call the solidarity economy. And it seems that the kind of explosion of these movements, of these cooperative efforts, tend to arise at moments of political or social tumult, or kind of economic collapse maybe. And so to think a little bit about the future, the near future, the next, say, 4 years, what do you expect to happen with the kind of cooperative ecosystem in this country? I mean, are you thinking that there will be kind of an expansion of co-ops, or might we be entering into a phase where the creation of co-ops is endangered?
Just a small question.
Sorry.
And I will address some of that, but I'm going to actually turn it back on you. Remember the question, but I'm going to flip it, right? Because I think it's important to take a step back, right, before we start kind of being prospective in terms of the work that you did and the understanding of utopia from the perspective of Detroit, and which was it's a historical moment that it was happening in Detroit, and you kind of ground it there. But it was happening kind of nationally, right, in Black communities nationally. So this idea and this yearning for utopia and and creating the kind of elements of utopia in different places that people were really buying into in different ways. I think it's important to start there, right? And we could next week come back for next week, because next week you'll get to hear from Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, and Asada Richards. And Jessica has written a book called Collective Courage, and it does that historical work starting in the 1810, around then, right, even before emancipation. She documents cooperatives, mutualism, mutual societies, and so forth, right? All of these social structures and economic relationships between folks that were resisting these enslaved and the recently freed Black folks, all the way through 2010, right? So there is a lineage in the U.S. that's really, really important to understand. And so, and I will answer the question, but I wanted to turn, because it is your book, right? How is that, how do you understand this history, and how are you describing it?
Yeah, so the book is really a constellation of stories about different, Black social visionaries throughout time. It's largely historical, but the story really begins from a personal place. So my paternal grandfather was born in a small town called Promised Land, which is like so on the nose. It makes it a little too easy. But this was a hamlet west of Nashville, about an hour west of Nashville. And it was founded in 1870, so, shortly after the Civil War, by emancipated pupils, many of whom had worked on, one of the kind of iron plantations that existed in that part of Tennessee. And this was a town that I grew up, going to every summer with my grandfather. It was for family reunions to get away from Detroit a bit and pretend that I was a country kid, which I definitely am not. But I didn't have at that time a real appreciation for the fact that, one, so many Black families did not actually come from, did not descend from places like this. But also, as I began to appreciate when I was older, there was such a vibrant legacy of these Black towns, or some people call them freedom colonies, or freedom settlements, etc. There were hundreds, like if not about like some people say there may have been up to 1,200 of these communities throughout North America, from Allensworth in California to Mount Bayou, Mississippi, Tulsa, Eatonville, Tulsa, exactly. Like you can keep naming them. So I was interested in looking at how these spaces were sites of resistance, sure, but also of community formation, of placemaking at a time when it was so hard for so many Black communities to create spaces that felt safe. And also, I was interested in countercultures too, and these really well-defined periods of social transformation, including in the 1960s and 70s, where our idea of what utopia means really begins to kind of explode. We think of hippies, we think of like back to the land movements, where predominantly young people, but many of them white, are wrestling with the effects of the Vietnam War and all kinds of issues. But I think I was not so familiar with stories at that time that really emphasize Black utopian movements. I mean, you might hear about the Black Panthers free breakfast programs and the Nation of Islam, but for a lot of people the conversation kind of stops there. But I learned in Detroit, my hometown, that at this time there were Black communes in Detroit and elsewhere. And it was interesting to me because Detroit is so often kind of misrepresented or mythologized as the quintessential American, dystopian city. Those narratives tend to focus on, images of dilapidated structures and abandoned factories, this post-industrial, ruinscape. But these histories tend to ignore the people who have actually always been there, are still there, and are still finding creative ways to make life enjoyable, bearable, sustainable. And so the book is really about that. It's about, this kind of long historical thread that, ties these spaces and these, more importantly, I think these social, like it's about a kind of orientation towards what is possible in life when everything has been, institutionally built to keep you out. And yeah, so that's really where it began for me.
That's right. Thank you. And I think that's a big part of the response to your question, right? Meaning we have always built these systems and institutions and organizations and emphasized relationality to survive, right? Because the superstructure or the institutions were always kind of either, because they're grounded in capitalism, they're always exclusionary, they're always extractive, right? That's historically, almost by definition. So we have a long history, and when I say the we, it's both kind of Black folks in the U.S., Black folks globally, but other groups. Every group has created these, both from enclaves to other ways of getting by and getting ahead. So what does that mean for our future, in which we are entering a very different moment? And I don't want to go too far down that road because it's a scary road. And I don't know. I mean, I read a piece, what's his name, Henry Mayer, I believe he wrote a piece about neoliberal fascism, and I was like, oh boy, as if as if you needed a qualifier for it was absolutely petrifying. But the point being, the things I actually think we're prepared in many ways. We're more prepared today than we were in 2014, than we were in 2016. Because over the last 10 years, organizations, at least I can speak to the cities I've visited for the last year and learned about over the last few years, cities like Boston, the ecosystems that are being built in those cities with great intentionality. It's very different than the older utopias that we speak of, which are, I guess Eric Olin Wright would say, those are examples of escapism. Those are examples of kind of creating these citadels, these kind of environments in which you exclude yourself from society, right, to protect and create those systems of safety. Whereas what we're doing now is we're deeply embedded in our communities. We recognize and understand and have a deep, rigorous analysis of the conditions, right, which are essential. And we are coming up with and designing and drawing on our history of resistance to develop these mechanisms, these strategies, these opportunities for both mitigating the systems of oppression, but also creating greater opportunities for us collectively, right? So when I speak about ecosystems, and each city it looks a little different. And I'm not looking at the city level. I'm really looking at how these organizations, these formations that have emerged over the last less than 10 years. It really depends on the city. And they're grounded in economic democracy, right? The solidarity economy, food sovereignty, land-backed strategies. And they're, the ones that I think are really hopeful, they're not silos. They're actually building coalitions, right? And I can go on and on here about, the coalitions I experienced here and the way in which folks here are aligned with folks outside of Boston and in other cities around public banking. I mean, things that are really important for the longevity, both of our communities kind of writ large. So I say that to say, things are not going to go well. We don't know. I'm just trying to kind of go past that really quickly.
I heard that. I caught that.
It's not going to go well. But nevertheless, the other part that I didn't mention is we've been putting energy into relationship building, right? Into cultural organizing, because that is what's going. We can have all sorts of non-extractive finance mechanisms. That's great, but if we can't get along, if we don't, and we sometimes won't get along, but if we don't have mechanisms for repair and for restoring our relationships and recognizing how the linked fate that we are inherently bound together, that we have to make this work. It's at that level that we've been having conversations at different, in different ways in different cities, that I say we're better off than we were in 2014. Let's say.
I want to pause on this, this idea of an ecosystem, because this I think is so kind of central to Black utopianism in general, like as an idea. And I think in recent years, the language to describe these kinds of ecosystems have varied. Some call them constellations. Some are very, like literally kind of rooted in the language of, like mycelium threads, right? These are the roots beneath us that unite different movements. When you think of some of the conditions that allow these kinds of ecosystems to flourish, what do you think are the conditions that sort of are most suitable for the spread of the creation of these kinds of coalitions? Because on the one hand, it's a combination of maybe support from above, right? Endorsement, or support from city or state governments, or even federal governments. But there's also a really crucial grassroots, bottom up approach. So can you talk a little bit about some of those conditions and some of the obstacles that groups may have faced when trying to create these ecosystems?
So I'm going to slip that.
I know you are. I know.
We know.
I had to put it out there.
Put it out there. So those are the things we'll engage. But I also want to hear more about how you understood or understand those conditions, what allowed for them to flourish, or kind of thwarted the possibilities in the cases that you looked at.
So there's the main group that the book is about was rooted in a Black nationalist church that started in Detroit. It was called it still exists. It's called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and it was established in the 1950s, but became popular to an extent in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And it was founded by this Black nationalist pastor named Albert Clegg Jr. And he was a radical in every sense of the word. He was kind of this firebrand leader of a coalition of Black nationalists in Detroit. He created this a social movement that he called Black Christian nationalism, and Black Christian nationalism was not white Christian nationalism, with the black face. It was a very different thing, and it arose for very different reasons. But I was interested in writing about and telling a narrative about the creation and sustenance of a social movement, because I think that, at least for me, I was hearing terms about the importance of community formation and coming together and having visions of a better world, and all of that was very important. But I felt like I wanted to understand how people in the 1960s and 70s, had really tried to come together to sustain a social movement. And in the case of the Black Christian nationalists, many of whom were young people who were shaped by the civil rights movement, right? They had watched the freedom rides on TV. They had experienced the urban rebellions of the 1960s. They may have gone to schools that were underfunded, right? And wanted to create better, educational conditions for Black children, et cetera. But it's hard to sustain a communal movement when you come from so many different places, right? And you might not necessarily share the same vision of the world that you're trying to work towards. And so I think that, the importance of narratives in the way that we think about the future was something that was very important to this movement. For example, the importance of attaining land for Black people and being able to use that to then grow food to send to inner cities throughout the country was very important to the Black Christian nationalists. And so in 1967, Reverend Clegg says that I want my people to attain the Beulah land, like this kind of, a place on earth that feels like it's ours, that we can like use for good. The church had a plan to attain, thousands of acres of land in the American South. And this was something that they vocalized in 1967. It wasn't until the late 90s that they actually acquired this land. Like after decades of people in the movement, raising money for it, not knowing if they were actually going to acquire land in the first place, right? And that is sort of the heart of it, right? They had named a farm that they hadn't even attained. They didn't know where it was going to be in the country. They didn't even know, a lot of the people who were part of this movement didn't even know if they would live long enough to see this land, actually come to fruition. So this idea of pre-figurative politics, right? Of kind of voicing something that you want to aspire to, that was a really powerful force. And I think, maybe that is one of the kind of key functions of utopia, is to orient us towards something that we can at least name, and we can set our eyes on that. But also, to get there, it's going to take a lot of work. It takes time and constant struggle. And I wanted to be attentive to the kind of emotional effects of that. Like people fell out of the movement over time. Like not everyone could be a part of this movement that for some took away their sense of, individuality, right? Like it's hard work to agree on a common goal for most of your life. And so there was a divide between those who stayed within the Black Christian nationalism movement, to this very day, in fact, and those who said, this is not really the vision of my life that I had.
Yeah, that's important to kind of remember that history, because there is a way in which I personally kind of romanticize the possibility, right? But I think the aspiration is a little different today than it was then. And it's also important to recognize there were a plethora of movements, at least even within kind of Black communities, right, for land, for some type of sovereignty, the Black Panthers were doing prefigurative politics, right? They were practicing the world they wanted to inhabit, right? They didn't, everyone talks about their food program. They had 65 programs in Oakland, right? It went from food to clothing to exterminating people's homes. I mean, it was a long list of programs based on what communities needed, right? But it wasn't just the practice. The end was not the program. Those are just tactics to help us organize and to understand that we can take care of ourselves, to build self-determination. Right? If you can take care of your neighbors, if you can take care of your community, people, that becomes what we call proof in the concept. It's so that you can buy into this movement easier because, it's feeding my children, it's clothing, But the vision was, at least the strategic orientation and the objective was much greater, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what got thwarted by the state. But you said a bunch of things, and so we can point to other examples. But I think contemporarily, when I think about these ecosystems, I'm thinking about what holds them in different cities is a set of values, right? And so when we use the term the solidarity economy, it has different meanings to different folk, indeed. But hopefully, at least the way I understand it and the way that others have written about it, it's grounded in a set of values and practices that are broad enough that we can agree to, right? Democracy, equity, ecological sustainability. There's pluralism in there, and there's one other that I always forget. But nevertheless, right? So those. It's not as dogmatic in many ways. And then there are a set of practices. So if those are the values, there are an array of practices from cooperatives and land trusts and participatory budgeting and public banks and so on and so forth, right? All of them, though, have what's holding all of that together is kind of this anti-capitalist logic, this understanding of capitalism as gendered racial capitalism as harmful, as always inherently harmful. Surely some win, but disproportionate number of folks lose. So the ecosystems in each place, as I say, they look different. And I went in as a social scientist saying, okay, I'm going to find the similarities and I'm going to describe, and then I'm going to show how all these cities have this thing, and that's it. That's it. That's what we need to focus on. And one thing I learned is that you really have to focus on what's happening grassroots. This is not a top-down movement, right? Where cities are getting involved in community wealth building, solidarity economy. And I hold those two terms separately for intentionally and because for me, solidarity economy is about the grassroots movement, right? The cities may get involved later, but this is about a grassroots movement. And the thing, although each city has a different set of practices, right? There are some things that I've noticed across the country, meaning there's often an organization or two that is playing a role of like helping to coordinate, helping to helping to bring some of these organizations and practices together. And again, that too looks different. But the point being, there is a way in which people can onboard. They can get involved, right? It's because once you have a worker cooperative, you can't just easily get involved. you have to be brought on as a member and a worker owner eventually. So how do just folks get involved? And so there's usually a set of organizations that help with that kind of onboarding. Those are to me, those are the critical elements kind of in ecosystems. And the second most critical and very different from historically is this idea of non-extractive finance, non-extractive capital. I often think about the Panthers when I think about how much money is in the movement. Like there was no money, right? Yeah. That just didn't exist. Now there might be, I'm not even going to say it, there's a lot more money. But what's important, it's not just that there's money, it's how that money is being cultivated, created, owned, how it's democratized, how the participatory processes allow for that money to be used, right? So that we have more agency over what we're creating. That is, in my mind, every city doesn't have the same set of things, but if there aren't on-ramps to non-extractive capital, then you can't sustain the work. If you're dependent just on philanthropy, you're dependent on the state, you can't sustain it that way. So again, I know I'm in Boston, but I talk about Boston all the time. I really do, because I think the fund is one thing, but also now moving toward kind of like membership, opening, trying to sustain more through membership so that you're responsible, accountable to your members. That's something that regardless of the administration, they can't do anything with that. That's a sense of power that I think most most of the ecosystems I've engaged are kind of, that's their aspiration.
Yeah. It's a hard thing. I think to it's tempting to get your funding, for a social movement from people like who are waving dollars at you, and that was something that Clegg, right after the rebellion in Detroit, he is one of the leaders of what's called the Federation of Self-Determination in Detroit. And this is essentially a coalition of Black leaders from around the city who are trying to think of ways to rebuild Detroit, like in the aftermath of this this chaos at the time. And it gets support from this, organization called the New Detroit, committee, which is largely run by philanthropists and business owners, and at a certain point, they all butt heads, and Clegg makes the decision to cut ties with this movement because he senses that their offer of funding is contingent on tamping down the fiery rhetoric.
Yeah.
And so what Clegg has to contend with after, and what so many other people, have to contend with is, okay, how can we build, how can we encourage the people who we want to have a stake in our community to actually, invest in what we're building? And sometimes the answer is it's not easy because maybe people don't completely understand what is being built, what is the structure of this thing, what is the end goal, and I think when it's not always so clear, that has been an obstacle.
Yeah, it is.
I wanted to ask you, if we have time, about we're talking about constellations, and we can think of that on a very local level, and also international too, right? I feel like we're at a point where there's a lot of conversation about solidarity movements across national lines, but also when something like this past election happens, if I may say, I think there is also a tendency to say, well, it's too hard for me to think about what's happening abroad, because I'm too concerned about what's going to happen to my school or my my kid, right? I don't have the emotional resources to think about what's happening so far away. I'm curious how you're thinking about that right now. Not to predict where we're going, but in these moments where I think maybe social movements are trying to figure out what's next for them, whether they pay more attention to the local or whether they still have their eye on a kind of transnational solidarity movement. I mean, what has been the experience of groups or movements that you've encountered in your own work?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think the groups that I think are the extremely thoughtful and kind of radical and in the best possible ways understand the importance of internationalism, that we learn from, solidarity economy did not emerge in the United States. That's not, we like to claim that's not ours. We didn't develop this thing. We add on to it, yeah. But that wasn't that very much. The language and practice comes out of Latin America, and even the infrastructure of these practices were, we can point to East Africa, West Africa, and as having more of the solidarity economy than what we have historically. But nevertheless, I think, in an American way, we take it and we make it big. We try to make it big. So all of that to say, you have to kind of understand how this has emerged and transformed other places. So the America's interest, or at least the folks doing cooperative work, interest in the Mondragon, right? So the Mondragon is this huge co-op in the Basque region of Spain. And there are like 80,000 worker owners. And it's in manufacturing and in finance and retail. It's huge, yeah? And it started in the 1950s under Franco, right? Under a dictator. And they built a school, they built a bank, and so forth. They built all of these elements. And so that in that area, it was the ecosystem, and it employed everyone. And it's currently the 7th largest kind of firm in Spain. And so Americans love that model. Like, wow, these cooperatives can work, right? They become big, these big corporations. But the context in which that happened and why that was successful early on before it became so big, that I think we can learn from that. We can also learn from Argentina. We can also learn, we have to learn from other places, in my mind. And then it's not just adopt, but we adapt, we learn, we try to look at our local contextual factors to see what could work here, very different political, cultural conditions. And that also includes all the policies and so forth that undergird our system. But nevertheless, I read about Yugoslavia, right? There's some really interesting models out there that we can take parts of and really try to see what that looks like. One thing I learned from Jessica Gordon-Emhart is the importance of these book clubs for this work. We can't just do it in our head. Right. We have to read the books and talk about it. It has to be through engagement. We have to be able to be in discourse and dialogue around these ideas that are somewhat antithetical to our everyday, antithetical to everyday kind of culture, the way in which we were trained from young in this country. And it's through those dialogues and through those spaces that you can just be open and a space of learning. That if we don't have those spaces, I don't see this working actually. Yeah. But it is those spaces, and that's not just the academic in me. I really see how important. I would say those are the three things: those reading groups, study groups, the non-extractive finance, and some entity that helps coordinate and bring people on, like on-ramping. Those are critical elements.
Also, how much time do we? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay,
other people.
Great. I mean, actually, I would prefer to open it up now. I mean, let's have a conversation. So, so thank you, Stacey, for all of your amazing work and
thank you.
How are you doing? So let's.
20 minutes, 15.
Okay, great. We have 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So, thank you.
Yes. Good. My name is Ayusa. My question is simple. What does success look like?
Yeah, it's actually the hardest question.
It's simple, not easy. What does success look like?
Yeah.
Right. And so, really, I wonder because, so we can have these almost little microconcentric, different units that are set up in different ways to do different things to move us forward or establish our, sustainability and, provide for our future. But how much of it do you need for success? Right? Because there were, for those of us that are in the run that are going to make it, right? There are a lot of us that are struggling in really, really hellish ways. And so, how much gravity do you need for this idea of a Black utopia to be successful?
Yeah. So just for those who didn't hear, the question is basically, what does success actually look like, while trying to build out a movement or, while trying to achieve kind of a better life? And my answer to that question has really shifted over the years, but I keep coming back to this idea of sustainability. I think there is a temptation maybe to think about the importance of progress in the sense of like there always needs to be some new like political coalition or some new way of thinking that can change our can change our world entirely. We need to build new structures, needs to constantly be expanding. And I think that like if I've learned anything in writing the book, but also in reflecting personally, one, it would be too overwhelming. Like if we were to think about, success only in terms of like, achieving like liberation for everybody, because then you just kind of want to curl up and, but it becomes like, what are the steps you need to take to sustain yourself so that you can help sustain other people, more long term? And I'll give you a concrete example of that in my own life. So promised land, like where my family's from, it's a ghost town now. There is a one-room schoolhouse that my grandfather went to and a church that still stands. But no one lives there, so they were converted into community centers now. They're kind of, cultural heritage spaces. My grandfather's cousin, she's getting older, but she is the one who really kind of put Promised Land on the map. And she is trying to think of ways to reuse this space, for kind of a different, generation of people. She's asked me and her daughter, who are in the arts, if we would, think of using Promised Land as kind of as like an artist colony or like an artist retreat space, for example. And at first I was like, okay, that sounds nice, but I don't live in Tennessee, be too hard. But, then time goes on and I start thinking, well, we are, I think, in a time where the emphasis on using language of neutrality is the very thing that is going to honestly suppress so many cultural histories, and that is going to attempt to erase the memories of places like Promised Land, actually, in Tennessee and elsewhere. And so what might it look like to use this small town that most people don't know about to try to resist what I think is going to come, And I think that if we can think on those terms, on a kind of a smaller scale thing that you have a really deep vested interest in, like what can you do? I think it's a more it's easier for me at least to think of success in those terms, and it hasn't started yet, but I think I might try to get this little colony going.
I like that. I love that. So how do I say this? So I would say that success is a big idea, right? Because it is about power, and it's shifting power. And I believe power can be shifted, though, right? And so it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work. But we have to first change our consciousness to shift power. And you're like, uh-oh, that's a big... No, it's big. It's big. But we're here, right? We're here, and then we can teach other people and so on and so forth. And then we can work at different scales. Mm-hmm. So... I as I was leaving the house, or maybe late last night, I forget when it was, I read about the land back movement in New York, right? Indigenous folks that were able to, how long they fought to get their land back? It is a relentless fight, and that is just one thing. Mm-hmm. But the degree to which we have a vision that this society can operate differently, we have to believe that stratification that you talked about, it doesn't have to look that way. So because I fundamentally believe in economic democracy. I believe in the power that we have as workers, as residents, as citizens, as so forth. That we've allowed the system to become this bifurcated system with the ruling class and then everybody else. That didn't always look that way, right? And so when we think about, oh yeah, this didn't always look that way. We didn't always have the tech bros that want to go, colonize the outer space like that. This is new, and so we can start to rethink and bring others into that conversation. And what I was hearing also in your comment was that there's a whole lot of folk that are not in these spaces, right? They're just not. One story in Chicago, and I'll just tell you very quickly. There's a worker cooperative that was started during the pandemic called Shy Fresh Kitchen. It's an important example because it was started by 5 formerly incarcerated Black women. And it was started, it's successful. It's a $2.5 million business now. Worker-owned cooperatives, they just brought on 2 new worker owners, and they bought their building, and they bought a house, and they're starting a housing cooperative. So they are making, last I checked, it was like $35 an hour. Formerly incarcerated Black women, they weren't getting a job. You know how they were able to do that? Because they had folks that helped an organizer that met with a co-op developer that met with them once a week or twice a week for a year to say, you can actually do this. We can help you do this. This can happen. This will be yours. And they stayed with it. And now they're all over the country talking about what they've been able to do. It's a huge success, right? Because and when you tell that to municipal leaders, they see that as a huge success too. Because no recidivism, all the positives in terms of how they're now engaged in community. We can have so many of those examples. I spoke to business leaders last week. It was the Chamber of, I don't even remember. It was Crane Business and all these, economic development folks. And I shared that story. And I said, don't raise your hand, but how many of you employ formerly incarcerated? It was crickets. Nobody, they just, right. And so this is why this model can work. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's good. So, yeah, I think, but we really have to believe, not just because, this is a good thing to do, that we can transform the system, right? If with the power of people, like we have to believe in the power of the mass people. Although I've become more and more disillusioned, I will say, quite honestly, just because you have millions of people in the streets. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't necessarily change.
Yeah.
So, did you have more question?
Oh, one more question.
Yeah, it's not good.
Oh, okay. One more question.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I keep working.
Oh.
What's some of your favorite authors and other writers?
Ooh, well, there are people who definitely directly influence this book. Saidiya Hartman, of course, like Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which if you haven't read it, it's kind of this multifaceted social history of the lives of Black women and queer women in, early 20th century New York and Philadelphia. And the way that she's a brilliant scholar and academic, but she hides all of that in stories and these beautiful narratives. And so she was a great model. Like Margot Jefferson, who is a cultural critic, memoirist, although like she would hate that term. Actually, she has this beautiful book called Constructing a Nervous System, in which she's essentially she's writing about herself through writing about some of the kind of cultural, figures that shaped her thinking. And so it's a way of writing about other people to say something about yourself. I could go on and on, but those are 2 people.
Yeah. You want me to say this one?
Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, so I would say Robin Kelly is perhaps Freedom Dreams. That's perhaps one of the texts that I always go back to because of his writing about movements and Black culture and so forth.